Well, it's hard to believe, but it's 25 years today, March 2, since John Howard brilliantly won the 1996 election. The man, rejected so often by his party and by the electorate, proved that with tenacity and faith in your own beliefs, your time would eventually come. Remember one thing, John Howard beat one of the most formidable political figures in Australian political history, Paul Keating. Keating had all the rhetorical talent, a formidable fighter. He also had minority groups like the Greens and the unions to support him. The Greens, of course, on the ballot paper. John Winston Howard is the second longest serving Australian Prime Minister, 11 years and 267 days. But of course, the critics are rarely right. At the lowest point of his political career, the then Bulletin magazine ran a cover story, "Why do you bother, Mr Howard?" Mr Menzies is our longest serving Prime Minister, 18 years and 163 days. But remember, in the mid-50s, the Labor Party split over communist infiltration into the union movement, and the anti-communist DLP was formed. Sir Robert Menzies could win government with DLP preferences, and he did. John Howard had no such luxury. So it's an extraordinary anniversary, and the Prime Minister Howard joins me tonight. Prime Minister, thank you for your time. I'm a great believer that the honorific should be retained, so you will always be Prime Minister to me. But today, what are you thinking, looking back?
Well, I'm very proud, I hope in a restrained way, of what we were able to achieve. It was a good government. It wasn't a one-man band. I would not have achieved what I did without, firstly, a very strong coalition led by wonderful people like Tim Fischer and John Anderson and Mark Vaile, and some wonderful ministers, Peter Costello and Alexander Downer. They were respectively the Treasurer and the Foreign Minister the whole time that I was Prime Minister, and they were outstandingly able men. And I had a very good group, Peter Reith, Philip Ruddock, the list goes on, of people who... So it was not just John Howard. No, although I tried to sort of give it a bit of guidance, but it is very important to understand.
It wasn't straightforward because you inherited deficits.
Oh, yes.
And you repaired them. I mean, you repaid $96 billion in debt and restored our AAA credit rating. But I want to ask you just a quick one on the Future Fund. You established the Future Fund. To what purpose? What was the purpose of that?
Well, the purpose of that was to pay the recurring liabilities of the Commonwealth for retired military people, retired public service. In other words, it was money invested to earn interest to pay future debt. Now, that was really very good husbanding. I mean, it is the case that when we were voted out in 2007, the Commonwealth Government had no net debt. Now, it was an amazing achievement.
And, of course, that enabled the Rudd Labor government to basically find their way out of the global financial crisis.
Yes, if it hadn't been for... Yep. Two things. When the global financial crisis hit, the two things that saved Australia was our huge resource trade with North Asia, particularly but not only China, but also the fact that we had left such an impeccable set of books. They were unrivalled. And as a result, we had a fantastic credit rating and there was money in the bank for Mr Rudd. And, of course, he spent
magnificent. Just on the GST, you went to an election promising a new tax, almost unheard of. When you then won, you had to compromise on this with the Democrats to get it through. Were there nervous moments taking a new tax to a general election? You wanted to replace outdated indirect taxes. Sadly, many of them remain, I might add. But what I thought was outstanding, you prosecuted this case in the public place. We don't do that enough today.
Well, I was nervous, but Peter Costello and I had done our homework. And we went on all the programs, as you remember, and we were grilled and questioned and so forth, and we came through and we won it. I always thought you could sell a big reform provided you could satisfy people on two things. Firstly, it was good for Australia. And secondly, it was fundamentally fair to the more vulnerable in the community. If you can satisfy those two criteria, then the public will go with you. And it was a near-run thing. We lost a lot of seats, but in the end, we got a mandate. Now, we did have to compromise, but I continue to thank Meg Lees and those in the Democrats who supported her for respecting the mandate that the public gave us.
Just on that, the GST fundamentally is a broad-based expenditure tax that everyone knows to replace stuff like payroll tax, which is a tax on jobs. And
well, we didn't actually replace payroll tax. No,
that's right.
No, it didn't. It wasn't meant to either, to be fair. No, but what it did replace was a clunky old wholesale sales tax, which applied to manufactured goods but didn't apply to services, yet services was a growing section of the economy and manufacturing was declining. So it was clearly not suiting our purposes.
No. Is it difficult, though, to administer a tax, looking back now, all these years on, when there are so many exemptions? Do we need, after all, if people are prejudiced as a result of a tax, we have a welfare system to look after them. Do we need to widen the base of the GST?
Well, the GST that the public voted for in 1998 was wider than we have now.
Yes.
But we had to exempt certain things in order to get the Democrats to support it. Because the Labor Party, notwithstanding the verdict of the electorate, the Labor Party opposed the GST. They said, we don't support it, we're going to vote against it, and they voted against it. And one of the things you've got to remember is that when they were in government, we supported a lot of their reforms, unpopular though they were, but when we were in government, that gesture was not repaid. But if the Australian people's verdict had been respected in relation to the spread of the GST, it would now be collecting more money than it is, but that's the nature of politics.
Right. The question of choice, a Liberal Party, of course, fundamental to it, part of its DNA, is freedom of choice. You abolished compulsory unionism. What was the rationale for that?
Well, choice. People should be free to join or not to join a union, just as people should be free, if they wish, to send their children to an independent school. I mean, 34% of school children in Australia are educated in the non-government sector. I mean, I went to a government school. I'm very proud of the education I received in New South Wales, but I exercised choice in relation to the education of my own children. Sometime they went to public schools and later on they went to private schools. Now, I think you should have choice, and it's very, very important when people who are concerned about the values taught in institutions and the like, that they have the maximum freedom of choice.
Yeah, private health insurance likewise, though I suppose today private health insurance seems to be climbing beyond the capacity of many people to afford, but the same principle applies there, doesn't it?
Well, private health insurance was completely flat on its back when he came to power, and it took the non-means tested 30% rebate to get it up to about 45%. Yeah. And that augmented the Medicare system, which we accepted. We didn't like Medicare at the beginning, I'll be honest, I was very critical of it. But after the Australian people voted in 1993 to reject our policies on taxation and Medicare and the like, I said to my party, we've got to accept the will of the people. They like Medicare, we've got to stick to it, guarantee we won't take it away in any fashion, and then on top of that, build private health insurance.
Right. Should the same worker have choice about vaccination?
Oh, people are free to, if they choose not to be vaccinated, but equally an employer, in my opinion, is free to say, well, I want all of my workforce vaccinated. Now, this is a matter for individuals. Look, I support vaccination fully. I don't have a lot of patience for anti-vaxxers, but I do nonetheless, if people conscientiously object to something within the limits of what is consistent with the rights of others, they should be able to have that choice.
What about voting, Prime Minister? Should the same worker have choice about voting? Should voting be compulsory?
Well, in theory, no. In practice, it's worked. And I often thought about this when I was in government, and I talked to some of my colleagues, and they said, John, if we were starting all over again, we wouldn't perhaps have introduced compulsory voting, but it has worked. And you've got to look at the total outcome of an electoral system. This is a very stable, cohesive country. And I think some people argue that compelling people to vote helps. Others argue that the grudging vote shouldn't carry the same weight as the willing vote. But everybody is subject to the laws enacted by the Parliament that's elected by those votes. So I'm a bit of a contradiction on the issue. We all are.
You're entitled to that. We are all contradictions.
We're all contradictions. I mean, in theory...
Does preferential voting give minorities too much say?
No, I'm a great believer in preferential voting because I saw years ago in a UK election, the then British Liberal Party got about 5 million votes, and the Tories and the Labor Party each got about 13 million, which is a bit less than 3 times. And the poor old Liberals ended up with a handful of seats, and the others had about 250 each. Now I think that's a bit rough.
I think it is a trifle rough. Now Waterfront. You and Reith were magnificent. This took a lot of guts. People forget at the time this was really tough. It was like Abbott turning back the boats. They said it couldn't happen. You improved productivity on the waterfront by 60%, but that was one of the roughest chapters of your Prime Ministership, wasn't it?
It was very hard. But what was satisfying in the end was that for years and years and years, the business community that had suffered the ravages of rotting exports on wharves and the like, and farmers even more so, said, when will we have a government and a business enterprise that got the guts to do something about it? We found that in Corrigan, in Chris Corrigan of Patrick's, and in Peter Reith I had a minister who was determined to endure all the pain, and we finally triumphed, and as a result the productivity of the waterfront rose very sharply. I'm very proud of that decision.
On that same productivity question, the Australian Building and Construction Commission. Again, productivity soared, but even to this day, Labor continues to seek to dismantle it.
No, it does. I mean, that was the brainchild of Tony Abbott when he was Minister for Employment. And to this day, the misbehaviour on building and construction sites is a continuing challenge, but it will get much worse if that body is dismantled, and a future Labor government would try and do so.
You and I, when you were the Prime Minister, had a lot of discussions about work choices. I want to raise this because I think work choices, and I've said this publicly, was the most outstanding industrial relations initiative ever. Obviously, it couldn't be retrospective, but the notion that the employer, in this day of working 24 hours a day and 7 days a week, the employer would work out with the employee how both their choices in relation to hours of work, rates of pay, how these things are worked out. And, of course, there'd have to be access to a referee in instances of dispute. I thought it was a marvellous initiative. On the other hand, it most probably buried you. How do you look back on it today?
Well, I think it was one of the things that hurt us. I don't think it's the main reason we lost in 2007. We lost in 2007 because people thought it was safe after a long period of one government, safe to make a change. The economy was going so well that a lot of people said, oh, we can take a risk with this other mob. They're saying nice things about the Kyoto Protocol. They're saying nice things about this, that and the other. And Mr Rudd seems a nice man. And so we'll vote for him. And in a sense, we're the victims of our own success. But look, I don't apologise for the policy I pursued on industrial relations. I think I made a mistake tinkering around with the no disadvantage test, and that enabled the unions to run a fear campaign, but it wasn't the main reason. It was a reason. But when you lose an election, there's got to be some reasons, and that was one of them.
That's it. One thing I remember about you and Malcolm Fraser was the constant repetition of the virtue of a strong economy, but as you used to say, not an end in itself. Now, we're heading into $1 trillion of debt. Can we say, as a Liberal Party, strong economic management is part of our Liberal DNA?
Well, I think we can, but we face the challenge of sticking to our guns in relation to the winding back of these emergency measures, and all the indications are that Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg, both of them, have done a great job with this pandemic. I think they'll do that. But we do have a lot of debt to repay. Fortunately, interest rates are at record lows. I don't remember interest rates ever being as low as they are now. But we can't be certain they'll stay low forever. And some of the activity on the bond markets in recent days indicate that investors are getting nervous about the level of interest rates some years down the track. So we have to stick to our guns on those emergency measures. That's very, very important.
How, as Prime Minister, would you handle the China issue today?
Well, I would understand that the main reason that things have gone bad with China is that China has changed. The leadership of China now is fundamentally aggressive towards the rest of the world, whereas the leadership of China 15 years ago, although very communist and authoritarian, was fundamentally wanting to get on with the rest of the world. So I think you have to first of all understand that. Secondly, I would make sure that there was no gratuitous harm done to the relationship. And I would always keep in the back of my mind that China is our greatest export destination. And you know, trade has to be ideologically blind on many occasions because it's in the long-term interests of a nation such as Australia, which is blessed with all these commodities, to continue trading with China. Thirdly, or is it fourthly, I would make absolutely certain that we did nothing to prejudice our fossil fuel industries and our capacity to export gas and iron ore and coal to China. It passes me as crazy that some sections of the Australian community want to shut down as soon as possible those parts of our industries that I mean, it's just foolish.
Just good. An economic suicide note. Look, before we go, you're unbelievable. Your memory is encyclopedic, I have to tell you. But we must just say something about a lady here. You and Jeanette were a wonderful team. I think I knew her as a quiet and intelligent supporter and an advisor. So in many ways, that was the real team, wasn't it?
It was, and I am forever grateful, not only for the fact that she agreed to marry me all those years ago, but been a wonderful mother but also a confidant and somebody who cares very much about the future of Australia, but took the view that I was the elected person. If she had a beef about something, she'd talk to me about it, and not sort of go off and get involved in the public debate. But I owe everything to the love and loyalty of my family, and without them I would not have achieved anything in politics.
Can I just say this tonight? I hope you feel a deep sense of pride as well as satisfaction with what you've achieved for Australia. And now you've become one of our formidable historians too. One night we'll talk about that. But it's always wonderful to talk to you, and I want you to know that Australians love you and love hearing from you. So congratulations, and may good health and continued happiness go with you, John Howard, and your family.
Thank you, Alan. You're very gracious.
Extraordinary human being, a great Australian. There he is.